When Jean-Pierre Moreau pressed his rivet gun against the aluminum fuselage of the Potez 63 aircraft on that humid morning in July 1943, working under the watchful eyes of German supervisors who had transformed the aircraft factory outside Lyon into a production facility for their own war machine, he felt the familiar vibration travel through his arms and noticed something extraordinary about the harmonic frequency that made him stop mid-rivet and stare at the metal skin with such intensity that the German foreman shouted at him to get back to work. But Jean-Pierre had just discovered that the specific resonance pattern created by the rivet spacing on this particular aircraft model, combined with engine modifications he'd been secretly documenting for months, could theoretically create an acoustic signature that would be invisible to German radar systems while remaining perfectly detectable to British radio direction finding equipment, an idea so absurd and technically improbable that when he finally whispered it to his childhood friend and fellow resistance member Antoine during their brief lunch break 3 days later, Antoine thought Jean-Pierre had finally cracked under the pressure of occupation. Yet within 8 months, that absurd idea would transform a fleet of obsolete French reconnaissance aircraft into the most effective covert communication network the Allied forces possessed, would enable the coordination of resistance activities that paralyzed German logistics across southern France, and would ultimately provide the intelligence that allowed Allied forces to execute the liberation of France with a precision that military historians would study for generations, all because a 34-year-old aircraft riveter had learned to listen to what metal was trying to tell him. Jean-Pierre Moreau had been working with aircraft since he was 16 years old, starting as an apprentice in the same factory where he now labored under German occupation. His father had been a master metalworker who had taught Jean-Pierre not just the technical skills of riveting, welding, and assembly, but also what he called the music of metal, the ability to hear and feel the subtle harmonics and resonances that indicated whether a structure was sound or compromised, properly assembled or dangerously flawed. It was a skill that couldn't be taught from books or diagrams. It required thousands of hours of hands-on experience, of touching metal until your fingers could read stress patterns like Braille, of listening to machinery until you could diagnose problems by sound alone. The Potez 63 was a French twin-engine reconnaissance and light bomber aircraft that had been in production since 1938. By 1943, it was considered obsolete by modern combat standards. The design was outclassed by newer fighters, its performance was mediocre compared to cutting-edge aircraft, and the French Air Force had suffered devastating losses of Potez 63s during the initial German invasion in 1940. But the Germans had seized the production facilities and continued manufacturing the aircraft, not for combat operations but for training purposes and secondary reconnaissance missions. To the Nazi occupation forces, the Potez 63 represented useful but unremarkable equipment, certainly nothing that could threaten their control of France. Jean-Pierre saw something different. He'd been working on Potez 63 variants for 5 years, and he knew every centimeter of the aircraft's structure, every idiosyncrasy of its design, every quirk of its performance characteristics. More importantly, he'd been secretly documenting modifications that German engineers had ordered to adapt the aircraft for their purposes, changes to engine timing, alterations to fuel systems, adjustments to communication equipment. Each modification created subtle changes in how the aircraft performed, and Jean-Pierre's trained ear and hands had noticed something that the German engineers, for all their technical expertise, had completely missed. The specific combination of rivet spacing on the fuselage, the particular alloy composition of the aluminum skin, the vibration patterns from the twin engines, and the electromagnetic fields generated by the modified communication systems, all of these elements together created a harmonic resonance that Jean-Pierre believed could be manipulated to produce a unique acoustic and electromagnetic signature. It was this signature that Jean-Pierre theorized could be used to create an invisible communication network. The idea had come to him gradually over months of observation and reflection. Jean-Pierre had always been fascinated by how different materials and structures produced different sounds and vibrations. He'd noticed that certain rivet patterns created standing waves in the metal skin that could amplify or cancel out specific frequencies. He'd observed that engine vibrations could be transmitted through the airframe in complex patterns that varied depending on engine timing and load. And he'd learned from resistance contacts who worked in radio communications that the Germans were using increasingly sophisticated radar and radio detection systems to locate and track Allied aircraft and radio transmissions. What if, Jean-Pierre had wondered, you could design a signal that looked like random mechanical noise to German detection systems but carried information that could be decoded by receivers that knew what pattern to look for? What if you could hide messages in the natural acoustic and electromagnetic noise generated by a working aircraft, making the communication effectively invisible to enemy detection? The more Jean-Pierre thought about it, the more feasible it seemed, at least in theory. The Potez 63's twin engines could be timed to create specific beat frequencies. The rivet patterns could be modified during assembly to create resonance chambers that amplified certain harmonics. The metal skin could serve as a giant antenna, broadcasting electromagnetic signals that would appear to be nothing more than the normal radiation from engine ignition systems. And because the Germans were producing these aircraft themselves, using French workers in French factories, there were opportunities to make subtle modifications that would never be detected by German quality control inspectors who were looking for obvious sabotage rather than sophisticated signal engineering. But taking this idea from theory to reality would require resources, expertise, and coordination far beyond anything Jean-Pierre could accomplish alone. He needed help from electrical engineers who understood radio systems, from physicists who could calculate the complex harmonic relationships he was intuiting, from resistance networks that could coordinate the implementation across multiple aircraft and receiving stations. Most daunting of all, he needed to convince people that this absurd idea was worth the enormous risk and effort required to attempt it. The resistance cell Jean-Pierre belonged to met in the basement of a church on the outskirts of Lyon. The group was diverse: factory workers like Jean-Pierre, students from the university, a few former military officers, shopkeepers, teachers, a doctor, a priest. They were united by their determination to resist the occupation in whatever ways they could, but they were also practical people who understood that resources were limited and that every operation carried risks of discovery, arrest, torture, and execution. When Jean-Pierre finally decided to present his idea to the group, he spent 3 weeks preparing. He created detailed technical drawings showing the rivet patterns and structural modifications needed. He wrote pages of calculations showing the theoretical harmonic relationships and signal characteristics. He built a small-scale physical model using scrap metal and salvaged electronic components to demonstrate the basic concept. He knew he would have one chance to convince this skeptical audience, and he needed to make every moment count. The meeting was on a Tuesday evening in late July 1943. 15 members of the resistance cell gathered in the damp basement, sitting on salvaged furniture and wooden crates, lit by a few candles and a battery-powered lantern. The cell leader was a former army captain named Dubois, a man in his 50s who had fought in World War I and who brought military discipline and strategic thinking to the resistance operations. Jean-Pierre has requested time to present an idea, Dubois announced to the group. I've seen his preliminary materials, and I'll be honest, I don't fully understand what he's proposing. But I know Jean-Pierre to be a serious and thoughtful man, so we'll hear him out. The floor is yours, my friend. Jean-Pierre stood, his hands shaking slightly as he held his papers and his small demonstration model. He was not a natural public speaker. He was much more comfortable with tools and machinery than with words and audiences. But the importance of what he was proposing steadied his voice as he began to explain. For the past several months, I've been observing something unusual about the Potez 63 aircraft we're building at the factory. The Germans have made numerous modifications to adapt these planes for their purposes, and these modifications have created some unexpected characteristics in how the aircraft generates acoustic and electromagnetic signatures. He went on to explain his theory about using the aircraft themselves as covert communication devices, about hiding messages in the natural noise of mechanical operations, about creating a network that would be invisible to German detection systems. As he spoke, he could see skepticism on many faces, arms crossed, eyebrows raised, heads shaking slightly. When he finished his initial explanation, there was a long silence. Finally, Antoine, Jean-Pierre's childhood friend who worked as an electrician, spoke up. Jean-Pierre, I mean no disrespect, but this sounds like science fiction. You're talking about turning aircraft into radio transmitters by adjusting rivet spacing? That's not how radio communication works. I know it sounds absurd, Jean-Pierre acknowledged. But consider this. Every mechanical system generates electromagnetic radiation as a byproduct of its operation. Engines create fields from ignition systems. Metal structures act as antennas. What I'm proposing isn't creating a radio transmitter from scratch, it's deliberately shaping and modulating the electromagnetic noise that these aircraft naturally produce anyway. A woman named Marie, who taught physics at the university before the Germans closed it, leaned forward with interest. The theoretical basis is actually sound, she said slowly. Any conductor in motion through the Earth's magnetic field generates current. An aircraft in flight is essentially a complex antenna with dozens of unintentional radiating elements. Jean-Pierre, you're suggesting we make these unintentional emissions intentional and information-bearing. Exactly, Jean-Pierre said, relief flooding through him at finally being understood. And because the Germans expect aircraft to generate electromagnetic noise, they won't realize that some of that noise is actually carrying coded information. Over the next 3 hours, the resistance cell dissected Jean-Pierre's proposal from every angle. The technical challenges were enormous. They would need to modify aircraft in ways that were subtle enough to escape German inspection but significant enough to actually generate useful signals. They would need to build or acquire receiving equipment sensitive enough to detect and decode the signals. They would need to coordinate between factory workers who could make the modifications, pilots who could fly the modified aircraft in specific patterns, and ground stations that could receive and interpret the signals. The risks were equally enormous. If the Germans discovered what they were doing, everyone involved would be executed, probably after brutal interrogation that would compromise the entire resistance network. The factory where Jean-Pierre worked was under constant surveillance, with German security officers watching for any signs of sabotage or resistance activity. Getting caught making unauthorized modifications to aircraft would be a death sentence. But the potential payoff was extraordinary. If Jean-Pierre's idea worked, the resistance would have a communication network that was effectively undetectable by German counterintelligence. They could coordinate operations across vast distances, share intelligence in near real time, and provide crucial information to Allied forces without the risk of their communications being intercepted and decoded. In a war where information was often more valuable than weapons, a secure communication network could change everything. Captain Dubois made the decision. We'll attempt a proof of concept. Jean-Pierre, you'll work with Marie and Antoine to refine the technical specifications. We'll identify one aircraft that we can modify and one location where we can set up a receiving station. If we can demonstrate successful signal transmission and reception on a single aircraft, we'll consider expanding the operation. But I want everyone to understand the risks we're taking. This is not a conventional resistance operation. This is experimental, unproven, and if it fails, the consequences will be severe. The next 3 months were a period of intense, anxious work. Jean-Pierre, working under the constant watch of German supervisors, had to identify opportunities to make subtle modifications to selected aircraft without being detected. This meant working during shift changes when supervision was temporarily reduced, making modifications that could be explained as normal construction if questioned, and coordinating with other workers to create distractions when necessary. Marie used her contacts in the academic community to access technical libraries and research materials that might help refine the signal design. Despite the German occupation and the closure of the university, scholars continued to meet privately and share knowledge. Marie was able to connect with electrical engineers, acoustic specialists, and physicists who contributed ideas and calculations, often without fully knowing what project they were supporting. Antoine, using his skills as an electrician, began building receiving equipment from salvaged components and black market parts. The receiver needed to be sensitive enough to detect weak signals from aircraft at altitude while being portable enough to be quickly relocated if German direction-finding equipment tried to track it. It was a significant technical challenge, but Antoine approached it with the methodical patience of a skilled craftsman. The test aircraft was a Potez 63 that Jean-Pierre had been carefully modifying over the course of 6 weeks. He'd adjusted rivet spacing along specific sections of the fuselage to create resonance patterns. He'd made subtle changes to engine timing that would produce specific beat frequencies. He'd modified the electrical system to create controlled electromagnetic pulses that would be indistinguishable from normal ignition noise to casual observation but would carry information to a receiver designed to detect them. The test flight was scheduled for October 15, 1943. A resistance member who was a pilot in the German auxiliary training program had agreed to fly the modified aircraft on what would appear to be a routine training mission. Antoine's receiving station was set up in a farmhouse 30 kilometers from the airfield, operated by Marie and 2 other resistance members who had technical training. Jean-Pierre spent the night before the test unable to sleep, his mind racing through everything that could go wrong. What if the modifications he'd made were detected during pre-flight inspection? What if the signal was too weak to be received, or too strong and attracted German attention? What if the entire theoretical basis for his idea was flawed and nothing would work at all? He'd risked the lives of everyone in the resistance cell on what might turn out to be an elaborate fantasy, an absurd idea that existed only in his own mind. The morning of October 15th dawned gray and overcast, with low clouds that would make the test flight more challenging. Jean-Pierre went to work at the factory as usual, his hands performing familiar tasks while his mind was entirely focused on what would happen that afternoon. The test aircraft was scheduled to take off at 1,400 hours. The receiving station would monitor from 13:30 to 15:30 to ensure they didn't miss any signals. Jean-Pierre had no direct way to know what was happening during the actual test. He couldn't leave work without raising suspicion, couldn't contact Marie or Antoine, could only wait and wonder whether 3 months of intense work had produced anything useful or had been a complete waste of time and resources. That evening, when Jean-Pierre finally arrived at the church basement for the resistance meeting, he found the group already assembled and waiting for him. The expression on Marie's face as he entered told him everything he needed to know before she said a word. "It worked," Marie said, her voice filled with awe and excitement. "Jean-Pierre, your absurd idea actually worked. We received clear, decodable signals from the aircraft. The signal strength was lower than ideal, but with refinements to the receiver design, we should be able to detect transmissions from aircraft at much greater distances." The room erupted in excited conversation as everyone began talking at once, asking questions, discussing implications, planning next steps. Captain Dubois had to call for order several times before the meeting could proceed in an organized fashion. "Let's be systematic about this," Dubois said. "Marie, give us a full technical report on what you observed." Marie described how the receiving equipment had picked up distinct patterns in the electromagnetic noise from the aircraft, patterns that occurred at specific times and in specific sequences that could only be intentional, not random mechanical noise. By correlating the signal patterns with the aircraft's known position and flight path, they'd been able to confirm that the signals were indeed coming from the modified Potez 63 and not from some other source. "The implications are significant," Marie explained. "If we can refine this system, improve the signal strength, develop more sophisticated encoding methods, train more receivers, we could create a communication network that spans all of France. Every German-operated aircraft factory could potentially become a source of covert signals. Every modified aircraft in flight becomes a mobile transmitter that the Germans themselves are operating, completely unaware that it's broadcasting resistance intelligence." The resistance cell made the decision to expand Operation Resonance, their name for the project, beyond the proof of concept to a full operational capability. This would require substantially more resources, more people, and more risk, but the potential value justified the investment. Over the following months, Jean-Pierre trained other factory workers in the subtle modifications needed to convert standard Potez 63 aircraft into signal platforms. The training had to be done carefully and discreetly. Workers needed to understand not just how to make the modifications but why each change mattered and how to make them undetectable to German inspection. It was less like teaching a technical procedure and more like teaching an art form, requiring workers to develop the same sensitivity to metal and machinery that Jean-Pierre had spent years cultivating. Antoine worked with Marie to build a network of receiving stations across southern France. Each station was staffed by resistance members with technical training and was positioned to monitor the flight paths of German training aircraft. The stations were mobile, designed to be quickly packed up and relocated if German direction-finding efforts came too close. Backup equipment was cached at multiple locations in case primary receivers were discovered and destroyed. The intelligence value of Operation Resonance became apparent within weeks. The modified aircraft were being used for German training flights that covered large areas of occupied France. By encoding information about German troop movements, supply routes, defensive positions, and logistics operations into the signals transmitted by these aircraft, the resistance could share intelligence across vast distances with near real-time speed and with effectively zero risk of German interception. But Jean-Pierre and the resistance network discovered something even more valuable. Because the Potez 63 aircraft were being used for reconnaissance as well as training, and because some of these reconnaissance missions were collecting intelligence for German military operations, the modified aircraft were sometimes in position to observe German activities that the resistance desperately needed to know about. A pilot who was sympathetic to the resistance could use the aircraft's inherent signaling capability to broadcast intelligence directly from the cockpit during flight, creating a real-time intelligence feed that was impossible for the Germans to detect or prevent. The system wasn't perfect. Signal strength varied depending on altitude, weather conditions, and the specific modifications made to each aircraft. Encoding and decoding messages was time-consuming and prone to errors. The need for absolute secrecy meant that very few people could know about the full scope of Operation Resonance, which limited how widely it could be deployed. And there was always the terrifying risk that German counterintelligence would notice something unusual and begin investigating. That investigation came closer than anyone wanted in January 1944, when a German signals intelligence unit detected anomalous electromagnetic patterns in the vicinity of German training airfields. The Germans couldn't identify the source of the patterns, but they knew something unusual was happening. They increased surveillance of factory workers, implemented more stringent inspection procedures for aircraft, and brought in additional technical experts to investigate. Jean-Pierre and the resistance cell had to temporarily suspend operations while the German investigation was ongoing. For 6 weeks, no modifications were made to new aircraft, no signals were transmitted, and everyone involved in Operation Resonance lived in constant fear that the Germans would piece together enough information to understand what had been happening. Several resistance members were questioned during routine security sweeps, and 2 factory workers were arrested on unrelated charges that everyone feared might be connected to Operation Resonance. The tension was unbearable. Jean-Pierre continued his normal work at the factory, knowing that every day could be the day that German security officers came to arrest him, that his home could be raided, that he and everyone he'd worked with could face interrogation and execution. He tried to maintain his normal routine, to show no signs of anxiety or unusual behavior, but the strain wore on him and everyone in the resistance network. Finally, in late February, the German investigation concluded with a report attributing the anomalous signals to atmospheric interference and possible equipment malfunctions in their own detection systems. The Germans had come close, terrifyingly close, to discovering Operation Resonance, but they'd ultimately dismissed what they detected as natural phenomenon rather than human engineering. The resistance cell cautiously resumed operations in March 1944, with enhanced security measures and even more subtle modification techniques. Jean-Pierre had refined his methods to make the signal-generating modifications virtually undetectable even under close inspection. Antoine had improved the receivers to better filter out background noise and extract weak signals. Marie had developed more efficient encoding methods that allowed more information to be transmitted in shorter signal bursts. By the time of the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, Operation Resonance was providing intelligence that was considered invaluable by Allied command. The network had expanded to include modified aircraft across multiple German-operated factories, receiving stations throughout occupied France, and coordination with British intelligence services that helped interpret and distribute the intelligence being gathered. The role of Operation Resonance in the liberation of France went far beyond simple intelligence gathering. The system enabled unprecedented coordination between different resistance groups, allowing them to synchronize sabotage operations, coordinate supply distributions, and avoid German security sweeps. When Allied forces began their advance from the Normandy beachhead, the intelligence provided by Operation Resonance helped them identify German defensive positions, locate supply depots, and understand enemy force dispositions with remarkable accuracy. One operation in particular demonstrated the full potential of what Jean-Pierre had created. In August 1944, as Allied forces approached Lyon, German command planned a strategic withdrawal that would have allowed them to regroup and establish new defensive lines further east. The withdrawal plan was known only to high-level German commanders, and Allied intelligence had no way to learn the details through conventional espionage. But a German reconnaissance flight using a modified Potez 63, flown by a pilot who had joined the resistance, passed directly over a German command post where the withdrawal plans were being finalized. The pilot, using the aircraft's signal capability, transmitted encoded information about what he could observe of German troop movements and logistics preparations. This intelligence, combined with information from other sources, allowed Allied command to understand what the Germans were planning and to position forces to cut off the withdrawal route. The result was a catastrophic defeat for the German forces attempting to retreat from Lyon. Instead of executing an orderly withdrawal, they found their escape routes blocked and were forced to either surrender or fight through overwhelming Allied opposition. The battle directly contributed to the rapid liberation of southern France and the collapse of German defensive positions throughout the region. After the liberation of Lyon in September 1944, Jean-Pierre returned to the aircraft factory, now back under French control, and watched as workers who had risked everything for Operation Resonance celebrated their freedom. Many of them still didn't know the full scope of what they'd been part of. They knew they'd been making small modifications to aircraft as part of resistance activities, but they didn't know about the signal network, the intelligence operations, or the strategic impact their work had achieved. Jean-Pierre was approached by a British intelligence officer named Colonel Richardson, who had been coordinating with French resistance networks throughout the occupation. Richardson shook Jean-Pierre's hand with genuine warmth and respect. "Mr. Moreau, I wanted to meet you personally to express the gratitude of Allied command for what you and your colleagues accomplished," Richardson said in accented but fluent French. Operation Resonance was one of the most innovative and effective intelligence operations of this entire war. The information you provided saved countless lives and shortened the liberation of France by weeks, if not months. Jean-Pierre felt overwhelmed by the recognition, uncomfortable with being singled out when so many had contributed. "Sir, I just had an idea. It was the work of many people that made it real." "Yes, but ideas matter," Richardson replied. "Particularly ideas that everyone else thinks are absurd until they're proven to work. Your ability to see possibilities in the harmonic resonances of aircraft construction, your willingness to advocate for an approach that seemed impossible, your technical skill in implementing modifications that German engineers never detected, these were the essential contributions that made everything else possible." In the months following liberation, as France began the difficult process of recovery and reconstruction, the full story of Operation Resonance gradually emerged. Jean-Pierre was awarded the Médaille de la Résistance and was interviewed by military historians documenting resistance operations. But he remained fundamentally uncomfortable with recognition, insisting always that he'd simply applied his technical knowledge to solve a problem and that many others had done far more dangerous and important work. The Potez 63 aircraft themselves, obsolete and outclassed by modern designs, were mostly retired or scrapped in the years after the war. But a few were preserved as museum pieces, and one particular aircraft, the original proof-of-concept plane that Jean-Pierre had modified for the first successful test in October 1943, was eventually acquired by the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace in Paris, where it was restored and placed on display with a placard explaining its unique role in Operation Resonance. Jean-Pierre visited that museum in 1968, 25 years after the original test flight, bringing his grandchildren to see the aircraft that had once seemed like such an absurd dream. He stood before the restored Potez 63, his hands reaching out instinctively to touch the aluminum skin, his fingers finding the precise locations where he'd adjusted rivet spacing to create those crucial resonance patterns. His grandson, a teenager interested in engineering, asked him what it had been like to come up with such an innovative idea. Jean-Pierre thought for a long moment before answering. "I don't think I came up with it so much as discovered it," he finally said. The aircraft was already there. The physics of harmonics and electromagnetic radiation were already understood. What I did was notice a connection between these existing elements that no one else had seen. And then I had to convince people that the connection was real and worth pursuing, which was harder than the technical work. "But they thought your idea was absurd," his grandson said. "How did you keep believing in it when everyone else was skeptical?" Jean-Pierre smiled. "Because I'd spent 20 years listening to aircraft, feeling their vibrations, learning their language. I knew what I'd observed was real, even if I couldn't prove it at first. Sometimes you have to trust your experience and intuition even when you can't immediately articulate why something will work. The key is being willing to do the work to prove your intuition correct." Jean-Pierre Moreau lived to see the publication of scholarly articles about Operation Resonance, the declassification of wartime documents that detailed the intelligence his network had provided, and the recognition of signals intelligence as a crucial element of modern warfare. He continued working with aircraft for the rest of his career, eventually becoming a senior engineer at the reformed Potez company, where he helped design civilian aircraft that incorporated some of the lessons he'd learned during the war about harmonics, resonance, and the subtle properties of metal structures. When Jean-Pierre died in 1983 at the age of 74, his obituary in Le Monde described him as the factory worker whose absurd idea changed the course of history. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Marie, his colleague from the Resistance, who spoke at his funeral and reminded the assembled mourners of what Jean-Pierre's story truly represented. "Jean-Pierre taught us that expertise comes in many forms," Marie said. "He had no formal engineering degree, no advanced academic training, no official position of authority. What he had was deep practical knowledge gained through years of patient attention to his craft, the courage to trust his own observations even when they contradicted conventional wisdom, and the persistence to turn an unlikely theory into working reality. In a time when many felt powerless against occupation, Jean-Pierre found power in his technical knowledge and used it to fight for liberation. His legacy is a reminder that innovation can come from unexpected places and that absurd ideas sometimes turn out to be exactly what the world needs." But Marie's eulogy, moving as it was, told only part of Jean-Pierre's story, the part that was publicly known and celebrated. What she couldn't mention, even decades after the war, was the darker chapter that had unfolded in the final months of the occupation, when Operation Resonance had been pushed to its absolute limits and Jean-Pierre had been forced to make choices that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In early 1944, as Allied invasion plans developed and resistance activities intensified, British intelligence had made a request to the French resistance networks that seemed both urgent and deeply troubling. They needed Operation Resonance to expand beyond passive intelligence gathering to active deception, using the communication network not just to transmit accurate information about German positions and movements, but to feed false intelligence to Allied command that would then be deliberately leaked to the Germans, making the enemy believe the Allies were planning operations in locations far from the actual invasion sites. The strategy, which would later become known as part of Operation Fortitude, required extraordinary coordination and an almost unthinkable level of risk. For the deception to work convincingly, some of the false intelligence fed to the Germans had to be so realistic, so apparently valuable, that the enemy would trust it completely. This meant that some resistance operations would need to proceed as if the false intelligence were true, that resources would need to be committed to operations designed to fail, and that potentially, some resistance fighters would be sent into situations where they had no chance of success, all to make the deception seem authentic. When Colonel Richardson had presented this proposal to Captain Du Bois and the core leadership of the Lion Resistance Cell in February 1944, the room had erupted in furious debate. Several members had argued that deliberately sending resistance fighters into doomed operations was unconscionable, a betrayal of everything they were fighting for. Others had countered that if the deception helped ensure the success of the Allied invasion, the sacrifice would save thousands of lives in the long run. Jean-Pierre had been present at that meeting, and he'd listened to the arguments with a growing sense of dread. His absurd idea had created a tool for resistance, for fighting back against occupation, for supporting liberation. Now that tool was being asked to become something else, a weapon of manipulation that would use people's courage and willingness to sacrifice against them. "This is not what I created Operation Resonance for," Jean-Pierre had said when asked his opinion. "I wanted to give us a way to fight, to share intelligence, to coordinate resistance. Not to trick our own people into dying for false objectives." Colonel Richardson, who had been sitting quietly during the debate, finally spoke up. "Mr. Moreau, I understand your objections, and they are morally sound. But please understand the strategic reality. The Allied invasion, when it comes, will be the most important military operation of this war. If it fails, if the Germans are positioned correctly to repel the landing, the war could be prolonged by years. Hundreds of thousands of additional lives will be lost. The entire outcome of the war could be at stake. And that justifies lying to people who trust us?" Jean-Pierre had challenged. "Justifies sending them to their deaths under false pretenses?" "No," Richardson admitted. "It doesn't justify it. It makes it necessary. There's a difference. War constantly forces us to choose between bad options and worse options. The question isn't whether this is morally right. It clearly isn't. The question is whether the alternative is even worse." The debate had continued for hours, with no clear resolution. Finally, Captain Du Bois had called for a vote among the resistance cell's leadership. The proposal passed by a narrow margin, with several members abstaining and one, a young student named Philippe, resigning from the cell in protest. Jean-Pierre had voted against the proposal, but he'd agreed to continue supporting Operation Resonance even as it took on this new, darker purpose. He told himself that he could continue making the technical contributions, the aircraft modifications, the signal design work, the coordination with factory workers, without being directly responsible for the deception operations. It was a rationalization, and he knew it, but it was the only way he could reconcile his conscience with the reality of what was being asked. The first deception operation began in March 1944. False intelligence about German troop concentrations in the Calais region was transmitted through Operation Resonance channels, along with encoded suggestions that the main Allied invasion would target the Pas-de-Calais area rather than Normandy. To make this intelligence seem authentic, a resistance sabotage operation was launched against rail lines leading from Calais to Paris, an operation that was deliberately planned with poor security and inadequate resources, designed to be discovered by German counterintelligence. 12 resistance fighters participated in that operation, believing they were conducting a genuine sabotage mission to disrupt German logistics. 8 were captured. 3 were killed during the raid. 1 escaped but died later from wounds sustained in the fighting. None of them knew they'd been sent on a mission designed to fail, designed to make the Germans believe the false intelligence about Calais was accurate enough that the resistance was actively preparing for an invasion there. When Jean-Pierre learned the details of what had happened, he was physically ill. He'd known the operation was happening, had known it was part of the deception strategy, but he hadn't known the specific people involved or the deliberately flawed planning that had made their capture nearly inevitable. 2 of the captured fighters were men he knew from other resistance cells, including François, a railway worker he'd trained personally in aircraft modification techniques. "This is murder," Jean-Pierre told Captain Du Bois after learning the outcome. "We murdered our own people to create a deception. How is this different from what the Germans do?" "It's different because our cause is just and theirs isn't," Du Bois replied, but his voice carried no conviction. "It's different because we're trying to end the war, not prolong it. It's different because we're fighting for liberation, not conquest." "Those are rationalizations," Jean-Pierre said bitterly. "François is dead because we sent him into a trap. His children are orphans because we decided his life was worth less than the deception we wanted to create. Tell me how that's justified." Du Bois was silent for a long moment. "It's not justified, Jean-Pierre. It's necessary. There's a difference I'm not sure I can explain to you or to myself. All I know is that if we don't do this, if the invasion fails because the Germans knew where it was coming, thousands more will die. The mathematics of survival in wartime are brutal." The deception operations continued through April and May 1944, each one calibrated to reinforce the false impression that the Allied invasion would target Pas-de-Calais. Each operation required some element of authentic resistance activity. Some had to succeed partially, others had to fail in ways that seemed plausible, and each operation put resistance fighters at risk for purposes they didn't fully understand. Jean-Pierre struggled with his role in this. He continued his technical work on Operation Resonance because he believed the intelligence-gathering aspects of the program were still saving lives and supporting genuine resistance operations. But he couldn't escape the knowledge that the same network he'd created was being used to deceive and manipulate people who trusted the resistance to act in their best interests. The moral crisis deepened in late April when Jean-Pierre learned that Sophie, his daughter who had been a courier before her arrest, had rejoined resistance activities despite her parents' objections. She'd been recruited for a new operation, one that Jean-Pierre recognized from the planning documents as another deception mission, another deliberate trap designed to reinforce the false intelligence about invasion locations. He confronted Captain Dubois immediately. "My daughter cannot be part of this operation. I'm ordering you to remove her from the mission." "You can't order me to do anything, Jean-Pierre," Dubois replied calmly. "And I can't remove Sophie from the mission because she volunteered for it. She knows the risks. She's choosing to participate. She doesn't know the real risks." Jean-Pierre said desperately. "She doesn't know this operation is designed to fail, designed to get people captured so the Germans will believe our false intelligence is real. You're sending her to be arrested, interrogated, possibly executed, and she doesn't even know why. If I tell her why, the operation becomes compromised," Dubois explained. "If she knows it's a deception mission, her behavior will change. The Germans will notice. The whole point of these operations is that the participants believe they're real. Then cancel this operation. Find another way to reinforce the deception. Don't sacrifice my daughter for this." Dubois's face was carved from stone. "Jean-Pierre, if I cancel this operation to protect your daughter, how do I justify that to the parents of every other resistance fighter we've put at risk? How do I explain that some lives matter more than others? We're all making sacrifices. We're all putting our families in danger. That's the nature of resistance." Jean-Pierre went home that night and told his wife Claire everything, about Operation Resonance, about the deception missions, about Sophie's involvement in the upcoming operation. It was a violation of security protocols to share this information, but he couldn't carry the burden alone anymore. Claire listened in stunned silence as Jean-Pierre explained the impossible position he was in. When he finished, she sat quietly for several minutes before speaking. "You have to stop her," Claire said finally. "I don't care about the deception strategy or the invasion or any of it. You have to stop Sophie from going on this mission. I can't stop her without revealing what the mission really is, and if I do that, I compromise the entire operation. Everything we've built, all the intelligence we've provided, all the lives that Operation Resonance has saved, all of it could be lost." "Then let it be lost," Claire said fiercely. "I don't care. She's our daughter." They argued through the night, with no resolution. In the end, Jean-Pierre made the hardest decision of his life. He went to Sophie the next day and told her he needed her help with urgent resistance work related to Operation Resonance, work that required her technical skills and would take several weeks to complete. The work was real. There were always modifications to be made, signals to be tested, coordination to be managed, but it was also make work, designed primarily to keep Sophie away from the deception mission she'd volunteered for. Sophie agreed, believing she was being assigned to important technical work, not knowing that her father was protecting her at the potential cost of the mission's success. Jean-Pierre had to live with the knowledge that by protecting his own daughter, he might be increasing the risk to other resistance fighters who would have to compensate for her absence from the operation. The deception mission proceeded on schedule in early May without Sophie's participation. The operation partially succeeded in its real objective, creating another incident that reinforced German belief in the false intelligence about Calais, but at a cost of 5 resistance fighters captured and 2 killed. Among those captured was Marie's younger brother, a university student who had joined the resistance the previous year. When Marie learned what had happened and then discovered that Jean-Pierre had deliberately kept Sophie away from the mission, the confrontation was devastating. Marie accused Jean-Pierre of valuing his own daughter's life above those of other resistance fighters, of abusing his position and knowledge to protect his family while others suffered the consequences of decisions he'd been part of making. "You knew this was a deception mission," Marie said, her voice shaking with anger and grief. "You knew the risks, and you made sure your daughter wouldn't be exposed to them while my brother walked into a trap. How dare you make yourself judge of whose life matters more?" "I couldn't sacrifice my own daughter," Jean-Pierre tried to explain. "I couldn't be part of sending her to capture and torture for a deception operation. I couldn't live with that." "But you can live with sending other people's daughters and sons?" Marie challenged. "With sending my brother? The only difference is that you loved Sophie more than you loved the rest of us." "That's not strategy, Jean-Pierre. That's just selfishness dressed up as parental concern." The accusation cut deeply because Jean-Pierre knew it was at least partially true. He had protected his daughter while others faced dangers that he'd known about but they hadn't. The fact that he'd struggled with the decision, that he'd agonized over the morality of it, didn't change the fundamental inequity of what he'd done. The confrontation with Marie fractured the resistance cell's unity at a crucial time. Some members supported Jean-Pierre's choice, arguing that any parent would do the same. Others sided with Marie, believing that resistance work required equal sacrifice from everyone and that Jean-Pierre had betrayed that principle. Captain Dubois tried to mediate, but the damage was done. Operation Resonance continued, but the moral foundation of the resistance cell had been shaken. The work proceeded mechanically, modifications were made, signals were transmitted, intelligence was gathered, but the sense of shared purpose and mutual trust had been compromised. Then came D-Day. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy, and the massive deception operation, of which the resistance operations had been a small part, proved extraordinarily effective. German forces, convinced by the accumulated false intelligence that the main invasion would come at Calais, kept substantial forces positioned away from the actual landing beaches. The deception saved thousands of Allied lives and was crucial to the invasion's success. As news of the successful invasion spread and the liberation of France began in earnest, the resistance cell gathered to celebrate. But the celebration was muted by the knowledge of what it had cost. The fighters who had been captured and killed in the deception operations, including Marie's brother, had died never knowing that their sacrifice had contributed to something larger than they could imagine. Colonel Richardson, who attended the celebration, took the opportunity to address the group about the moral complexities of what they'd participated in. "What you did was necessary," Richardson said. "The deception operations, as difficult and morally troubling as they were, contributed to the success of the invasion. The lives lost in those operations saved many more lives on the beaches of Normandy. But I want to be clear, the decision to conduct those operations, the moral responsibility for asking you to participate in them, rests with Allied command. Not with Captain Dubois, not with Jean-Pierre Moreau, not with any of you. You were fighting a war against an enemy that gave you no good options, only terrible choices and slightly less terrible choices." He paused, looking directly at Jean-Pierre. "Mr. Moreau, your innovation made Operation Resonance possible, and your technical skill kept it functioning through months of dangerous operations. But I know you've struggled with how the program was used in the final months. I want you to understand something. The intelligence your network provided saved thousands of lives. Not just through the deception operations, but through the accurate intelligence about German positions, movements, and logistics. The balance sheet, if we can even speak in such crass terms about human lives, is overwhelmingly positive." "That doesn't absolve the moral cost," Jean-Pierre replied quietly. "It doesn't bring back the people who died in operations designed to fail. It doesn't undo what we did." "No, it doesn't," Richardson agreed. "War doesn't offer absolution, only outcomes. We can't undo the choices we made. We can only try to ensure that the sacrifices people made weren't wasted, that we build something better from the ashes of what we've destroyed." In the weeks following D-Day, as Allied forces pushed inland and the liberation of France accelerated, the immediate demands of resistance work gave way to questions about what would come next. The German occupation was ending, but the moral and emotional scars it had left would take much longer to heal. Jean-Pierre and Marie slowly began to reconcile, though their friendship would never fully recover from the damage done during the deception operations. Marie came to understand, intellectually if not emotionally, that Jean-Pierre had been placed in an impossible position. Jean-Pierre came to accept that his choice to protect Sophie, while understandable as a parent, had indeed been a betrayal of the principle that all resistance fighters bore equal risks. Sophie herself didn't learn the full truth about the deception missions until after the war, and when she did, her reaction was complex. She was grateful that her father had protected her, but she was also troubled by what that protection had meant for others. She spent years working with veterans organizations and resistance survivors, trying in some way to honor the sacrifices of those who hadn't been protected as she had been. As France was liberated and life slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy, Jean-Pierre returned to work at the aircraft factory, now once again under French control. The work was familiar, comforting in its predictability. The same machines, the same rhythms, the same satisfaction of creating something tangible from metal and skill. But something had changed fundamentally. Jean-Pierre could no longer see his work as purely technical, purely mechanical. Every rivet he placed, every structure he assembled, carried with it the weight of memory and moral consequence. The Potez 63 aircraft that had been the platform for Operation Resonance were gradually retired from service, replaced by newer designs that better suited post-war needs. Jean-Pierre occasionally thought about how strange it was that these obsolete aircraft, dismissed by the Germans as mere training platforms, had played such a crucial role in the liberation of France. It seemed fitting, somehow, an underestimated tool deployed in unexpected ways by people no one had seen as significant. In 1948, when the aircraft destined to become a museum piece was being prepared for preservation, Jean-Pierre was invited to inspect it and ensure that its unique modifications were properly documented. As he walked around the aircraft, his hands touching the metal skin with familiar ease, he found himself thinking about all the layers of meaning embedded in this machine. To casual observers, it was just an old military aircraft, a piece of history preserved for educational purposes. To aviation historians, it was an example of French aircraft design in the late 1930s. But to Jean-Pierre, it was a physical embodiment of innovation, sacrifice, deception, and the impossible moral choices that war forced upon ordinary people trying to do extraordinary things. He spent that day meticulously documenting the modifications he'd made, the specific rivet patterns, the subtle changes to electrical systems, the carefully designed resonance chambers built into the structure. He wrote detailed notes explaining the theory behind each modification, how they worked together to create the signal characteristics that had made Operation Resonance possible. He included technical diagrams, mathematical calculations, and practical observations about the challenges of implementing these modifications under German supervision. But he also wrote a separate, personal document, never intended for public release, about what Operation Resonance had cost in human terms. He wrote about François, the railway worker who had died in a deception mission. He wrote about Marie's brother, captured and executed. He wrote about all the resistance fighters who had sacrificed everything, some knowingly and some unknowingly, to make the program work. This aircraft represents both the best and worst of what humans can do, Jean-Pierre wrote in that private document. It represents innovation and courage, certainly. But it also represents manipulation and the willingness to sacrifice others for strategic objectives. I created a tool for resistance, but that tool was used in ways I never intended and couldn't control. I have to live with that knowledge. Every person who sees this aircraft in the museum will see a symbol of liberation. I will always see a reminder of what liberation cost and who paid the price. Jean-Pierre kept that personal document hidden for years, never sharing it with anyone, not even Claire. But as he grew older and watched his grandchildren grow up in a France that was free and prosperous, he began to think that perhaps the document should be preserved as well, not to diminish the achievements of Operation Resonance, but to provide a complete picture of what those achievements required. In 1975, 30 years after the end of the war, Jean-Pierre donated his personal papers to the French National Archives, including the document about the moral costs of Operation Resonance. He stipulated that the materials could be made available to serious researchers but requested that they not be sensationalized or used to attack the memory of those who had made difficult decisions during the occupation. Historians who later accessed these materials found them profoundly moving. Jean-Pierre's honesty about the moral complexities of resistance work, his willingness to interrogate his own choices and accept his share of responsibility for difficult outcomes, provided a much more nuanced understanding of what the resistance had been than the heroic narratives that dominated popular memory. One historian, a woman named Dr. Sophie Fontaine, no relation to Jean-Pierre's daughter, wrote an acclaimed book in 1985 about the ethical dimensions of resistance work during World War II. She devoted an entire chapter to Operation Resonance and Jean-Pierre's struggles with how the program had been used. What makes Jean-Pierre Moreau's story so important, Dr. Fontaine wrote, is not just his technical innovation but his moral courage in confronting the consequences of that innovation. Many innovators prefer to focus on the positive applications of their work and to distance themselves from any negative uses. Moreau did the opposite. He forced himself to engage with the full complexity of how his creation had been deployed, including the ways it had been used to deceive and manipulate. This kind of moral honesty is rare and valuable. When Jean-Pierre was invited to speak at the book launch for Dr. Fontaine's work, he was hesitant. He was 76 years old by then, not in the best of health, and uncomfortable with the continued attention his wartime work attracted. But Dr. Fontaine persuaded him to attend, arguing that his perspective was important for current generations to hear. At the book launch, held at the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace in front of the preserved Potez 63, Jean-Pierre spoke to an audience of historians, veterans, students, and family members about what he had learned from his experience. When I first noticed the harmonic patterns in these aircraft, Jean-Pierre began, his voice still strong despite his age, I thought I was discovering something purely technical. I thought I was finding a clever solution to a communication problem. I didn't understand that I was creating something that would force me and everyone involved in Operation Resonance to confront fundamental questions about means and ends, about sacrifice and manipulation, about the price of liberation. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The resistance is often portrayed as a simple moral equation. We were good, they were evil, and everything we did was justified by that distinction. But the reality was far more complicated. We made choices that saved lives and choices that cost lives. We performed acts of courage and acts of deception. We protected our own while putting others at risk. And we did all of this while trying to maintain some sense of moral integrity in a situation where moral clarity was impossible. I'm proud of what Operation Resonance accomplished, Jean-Pierre continued. I'm proud that my technical skills contributed to the liberation of France. But I'm not entirely at peace with how it was done or what it cost. I don't think I should be at peace with it. The discomfort, the moral uncertainty, the ongoing questions about whether different choices might have been better, these are the prices we pay for participating in events that exceeded our ability to control or fully understand them. He looked around at the audience, his gaze stopping briefly on his daughter Sophie, who had come to support him, and on his grandchildren, who were hearing details of his wartime experience that he'd never shared with them before. The lesson I want to leave with you, Jean-Pierre concluded, is not that innovation is dangerous or that resistance work is morally compromised. The lesson is that when you create something new, when you develop a capability that others will use, you bear some responsibility for how it's deployed. You can't control everything, but you can refuse to hide from the consequences. You can insist on honesty about what was done and what it cost. You can remember the people who paid the price for your innovations, even when, especially when, that remembering is uncomfortable. The audience was silent for several seconds after Jean-Pierre finished speaking, and then the applause began, not the enthusiastic, celebrating applause that often greets war heroes, but something more solemn and respectful, an acknowledgement of the moral complexity he'd articulated. After the event, many people approached Jean-Pierre to thank him for his honesty. Several veterans of the resistance shared their own stories of moral compromises and difficult choices, grateful to hear someone else acknowledge the complexity they'd experienced. Younger people, students, and researchers thanked him for providing a more nuanced understanding than the simplified narratives they'd encountered in textbooks. But the conversation that mattered most to Jean-Pierre was with Marie, his old colleague from the Resistance, who had also attended the book launch. They hadn't spoken in several years, and the relationship that had been fractured during the war had never fully healed. Marie approached Jean-Pierre after most of the crowd had dispersed, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, two elderly people carrying decades of shared history and unresolved pain. "Thank you for what you said," Marie finally spoke. "About the costs and the complications. About not being at peace with how things were done." "I should have said it years ago," Jean-Pierre replied. "Should have had this conversation with you when it mattered more." "Maybe we weren't ready to have it then," Marie said. "Maybe we needed time and distance to see things clearly. My brother's death, I blamed you for that for so long. I blamed you for protecting Sophie when you didn't protect him." "You had every right to blame me," Jean-Pierre said quietly. "I made choices that prioritized my family over the collective good. That's exactly what I did, and I've never found a way to fully justify it." "I understand now why you did it," Marie said. "I don't know if I forgive it. Forgiveness is complicated, but I understand it. And I know you've carried the weight of those choices for 30 years. Maybe that's its own kind of punishment and redemption." They talked for over an hour, finally having the conversation that should have happened decades earlier. They couldn't undo the past or fully resolve the moral complexities of what had happened, but they could at least acknowledge them honestly and try to find some measure of peace with what couldn't be changed. When Jean-Pierre returned home that evening, Claire was waiting for him. She'd chosen not to attend the event, finding it too difficult to revisit those years, but she wanted to know how it had gone. "It was hard," Jean-Pierre told her honestly, "but necessary. I think I needed to say those things publicly, to stop hiding behind the simplified hero narrative that everyone wanted to tell. And I needed to finally have a real conversation with Marie about what happened during the deception operations." "Can you find peace now?" Claire asked. "I don't know if peace is possible," Jean-Pierre admitted. "But maybe acceptance. Maybe understanding that the war put all of us in impossible positions and that we did the best we could with terrible options. That has to be enough, because it's all we have." Jean-Pierre Moreau passed away in 1983, and his funeral was attended by hundreds of people, family, friends, fellow resistance members, veterans, historians, and former factory workers who had learned from him. The eulogy that Marie delivered, focusing on the publicly known aspects of his story, was only part of his legacy. The other part, the more complex and troubling part, lived in the archives and in the memories of those who knew the full story of Operation Resonance and what it had required. The Potez 63 aircraft still stands in the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace, silent testimony to what can be accomplished when technical skill, creative thinking, and moral courage come together. The rivet patterns that Jean-Pierre so carefully designed are still there in the aluminum skin, invisible to casual observers but containing within them multiple layers of meaning. The story of innovation, yes, but also the story of sacrifice, deception, moral compromise, and the impossible choices that war forces upon people who are trying to do the right thing in situations where there are no right answers, only answers that hurt less than the alternatives. Visitors to the museum see an artifact of military history, an example of innovation during wartime. But those who know the complete story see something more complex, a reminder that heroism is rarely simple, that innovation carries moral weight, and that the price of liberation is always higher and more complicated than the histories we choose to tell ourselves about our finest hours.